All right, guys, we're back. And today we are taking a look at the working lives of kind of the lower class. We've already looked at the wealthy robber barons or captains of industry based on how you view them. Today we're taking a look at the other half, right? The very lower class, not half, it really was much, much higher. These were the largest percentage of working people in America. And so what we're going to see is that life is really hard. It's really hard for the average family in this gilded age, this age of industrialization, the age of urbanization. It's tough. It's tough to make ends meet. And the reality is that poverty was really the standard. This was what most people had to deal with. In fact, the whole family often had to go to work in order to make ends meet. Uh, Both mom and dad and the children would do what they could to earn money, and then they would pool that money to meet their expenses. And sometimes even that wasn't enough. So it's a really difficult time. And what we'll see is that unemployment was really, really high for men, particularly in factories. Now, they would work in heavy manufacturing, things like mining, steel mills, things that required a lot of physical strength and stamina, that were hot, heavy work. They would do those jobs. But if you couldn't find those types of jobs, a lot of factories didn't want to hire men. They would prefer to actually hire women. Men required full wages. You had to pay a man kind of a livable wage. So men that could found work in heavy manufacturing, but oftentimes they really struggled to find that in many cases. Instead, the lower class women often worked in light manufacturing, things like textile mills, and they were paid far less. Now, the justification for that is that at that time, right, women were seen as kind of under the protection and provision of either their father if they were young and unmarried, or if they were married, they were kind of under the protection and provision of their husband. So anything that they earned should have been icing on the cake, because if their husband is working, he's bringing home the wage. It's his job to bring home the bacon, so to speak, to earn the money for the family. And anything that she does is, again, just extra. Now, that's the theory. In reality, it doesn't work out as neatly, right? Because there were many unemployed men. So many manufacturers kind of justified their lower wages to women based on that theory. They justified paying children even less, because children certainly didn't need to be the major breadwinners for the home. Anything they brought home was simply, again, extra for the family. And children would work in families just like men and women. In fact, their small size allowed them to get behind or in between machines much easier. Smaller hands meant they could reach things that maybe others would struggle with. And so they were hired to do things that were really menial work, but that needed to be done. Here we see a couple of what are called bobbin boys. Andrew Carnegie himself was a bobbin boy in a textile factory. The machines did not stop, but when they ran out of thread, these bobbin boys would often have to snatch the spools off, replace the spools with a full one, and then feed the thread into the machine. So they were paid, again, considerably less money because they were children. So a full wage went to a man, half of a wage went to a woman, and then a quarter of a wage often went to children. That's kind of the way that they operated. Now, the conditions in the factories were absolutely abhorrent. Not like today's factories. Today's factories, all things considered, by comparison, are clean, well spaced, well lit. There are all sorts of safety protocols in place to prevent injuries. But back then, factory work was really very low paying work. You worked very long hours, 10, 12, 14-hour shifts. The factory floor was often very crowded and cramped. The machines, they wanted to get as many as they could into the space that they had. And so those cramped conditions often made for a little more dangerous maneuvering. With all, especially in places like textile mills or places working with coal and so forth, the air quality was often very low. With all of these machines, oftentimes there were fumes or there's lint and things in the air from the manufacturing process. And so that could be hard on people's lungs. It was also very noisy. I would imagine that factories in that day and age could have become a very disorienting place for the senses. Loud, poor air quality, very crowded and cramped, maybe not lit as well as it should be. As a result, accidents were really very common. Workers had no protections, they had no health insurance, there was no workers' compensation. So if you were unable to do your job, they simply replaced you with somebody that could. Um, the machines did not stop, they were all linked together. And this is a great picture. I'm going to zoom in on this. Today, every machine is really kind of self or isolated, right? It's run independently. But what we see here is all these machines are being operated by a belt. Now, that belt, that's what these long things here are. They go up to a drive shaft that runs the length of the floor. That's being powered by a steam engine, coal-fired steam engine. And so when this thing turns, it operates all the machines throughout the entire floor by turning the belts that operate them. So if this lady here gets her garment or her hair or her hand caught in a machine, the machine doesn't stop, because to stop the machine would mean to stop all of these machines, and that was often very difficult to do. They weren't isolated where you hit a button and that machine stops. And so they really could be very dangerous and difficult places to work. Um, Again, we see that in this picture as well, and I'll zoom in on that. We see the drive shafts along the top and then the belts running down. So there were a lot of moving pieces, and it was not hard for hair or a loose garment or a hand. People had industrial accidents all the time. They'd get caught up in these machines that were moving very, very quickly. And we talked about if you were injured, you were replaced. Well, workers had very few rights. They were easily replaced because the factory workers didn't have a lot of skill. They didn't have a lot of education. The jobs that they did didn't require those things. And so if it's not a skilled job, then anybody can do it. And what we see here is a boatload of immigrants. These came in several times a day from countries all around the world. And so all of these people are coming to this country with no job. All of them are looking for opportunity. And so what that means is that you are easily replaceable. It's going to depress wages. It's going to mean high competition for the handful of jobs that are available. And until there's more of an equilibrium, the upper hand is always going to go to the owners of these factories because you're easily replaced. That was kind of what was going on in that day and age, and it's what made life for many of the lower class so difficult and unbearable. With little ability to save much or earn much, and as easily as they could be replaced, many of the lower class often were kind of stuck in this cycle of poverty. And so it often became generational. If you were a family that needed everybody to work in order to make ends meet, your child wasn't getting the education they needed to do anything but factory work. So then their children are going to be needed to bring money into the household income, and they would be required to work. And so it really becomes this thing that self-replicates. Guys, I appreciate you working. This is a fascinating time to study. It's really very interesting and sad. But I hope that you learned something. I hope you enjoyed the video. Go ahead and like it, subscribe, watch any of the other videos that I've got. I'd love to hear from you, so be sure to leave comments. Until then, guys, thanks for watching, and I will have another video here shortly.